I'm Dr. Peter Saunders. I am the CEO of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, ICMDA, and we're interviewing Alexander Fink today on the question of, am I more than my brain? Neuroscience and the Christian Faith.
I'm Alexander Fink. I'm the director of the Institute for Faith and Science in Germany, in Marburg, and I have studied physics and have a PhD in biophysics, and I've produced a documentary movie on Am I More Than My Brain?
Alex, it's great to have you today. You're the director of the Institute of Faith and Science in Marburg, Germany. You've got a background in physics, you've got a PhD in biophysics, you've been on the European Leadership Forum steering group for some years, and you've also been very much involved in the IFES graduate movement as well. And I know it's a particular interest of yours, this whole interface of neuroscience and the Christian faith. So I wonder if we could just start with your background. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to wanting to explore and know more and speak on the interface of neuroscience and Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, as I've studied physics, and I had lots of discussions with my friends, I realized that a huge temptation and mindset among physicists and scientists in general is to explain everything by purely material causes. And that starts with the universe and that goes on to animals and to human beings in the end. And so the question is, do naturalistic accounts of human beings really do justice to who we really are? And that's actually a question where I realized that starts even among school students already. So I thought it's necessary to have a resource and to give an answer to these questions, and at least to show that it's at least not the only explanation, and probably even not the most plausible explanation, a naturalistic account of who we are as human beings.
So we're fed this line that we're nothing but the product of matter, chance, and time in a godless universe, and part of this mechanism. And then Christians can be forgiven to thinking, so where does God fit into that scheme? And where does consciousness and free will and all these things fit into it?
Exactly, yeah.
But and we're going to get into that, but I want to first just ask you, give us some fun facts about the human brain. What do we know now about the brain?
Well, the human brain is fascinating, and it's active 24 hours and 7 days a week, and it only stops when you take a test or want to have a conversation with someone who is attractive. That's the first fun fact, I think. But actually, the human brain is really fascinating. If you think about, there are as many neurons in our skull as there are stars in our galaxy, in our Milky Way, about 100 billion. That's about the order of magnitude. And they are present right when you are born. They are just not yet all connected at that point, and one of these neurons can actually be connected to up to 10,000 other neurons. So it's an amazing network that we have here in the brain. And to just give you an impression what that means physically, if I pulled out all my neurons and the connections of the neurons out of my brain and...
Please don't.
Okay, I won't, sorry. I don't want to scare you. But if I produce a very long line, how long would that line be from here? Would it be until Beijing? No, it will be longer. It will be to the moon and back. It's 750,000 kilometers, somehow, something like that. So it's a really long distance. And all that is in our brain. That shows the complexity of this organ that we have. And if you go to the supermarket and just buy the ingredients of the brain, you would have to pay €2 for that, because it's just 80% water, 10% fat, and 8% proteins, and 2% some other molecules. So it's really not that expensive, but the structure is amazing. And the most important or fascinating fact is actually that the brain has some similarities with highways, actually, because those roads that are frequently used will be reinforced, 2-tracked, 3-tracked, 4-tracked, and so on. So what fires together, wires together. That means our brain is permanently under construction. So if you don't use some activities of your brain, then they will degenerate. And if you use some, they will be reinforced. And so there might be even a possibility when you're dead that people can find out, well, this person was a taxi driver, for example, because all these areas for localization and orientation in space are really hardwired, so to say. So that's fascinating. Even identical twins do have unidentical brains. They are different. So every brain is unique as every person is unique.
And how quickly is our understanding of the brain growing? Is new technology helping us to learn more and more about the brain? And how much more is there, do you think, that we still need to know?
Well, we interviewed a Nobel Prize winner, and he said that we have about understood 2% of the brain, even though we know quite a lot already. I mean, we can do operations, surgeries on the brain and treat Parkinson, actually, with certain electrodes in the head. And so on. So there is an amazing thing that there are amazing things that we know already, and still the leading scientists would say, well, it's still way below 10% that we know about the brain because it's so complex. And how do we know? Well, in ancient days, they would just cut open skulls. I'm very glad that we don't have to do that anymore today. And the revolution was actually in the 20s, 100 years ago. The EEG, the electroencephalography, when we just measure electrical fields and can have a look into the brain without having to open the skull. And even better was in the 1970s, the discovery of magnetic resonance tomography. And we can do very well resolved spatial pictures and slices of the brain.
The newer technologies past NMR, which are giving us more information we didn't have before.
Yeah, NMR is probably the choice today, because you can measure magnetic fields in the brain, and you can also stimulate the brain by magnetic fields and see how the impulses of the magnetic fields are actually distributed in the brain and so on. And that can tell you things about how the brain is wired, how networks correlate. Because the fascinating thing is that during certain, the brain is always active, as I indicated in my joke at the beginning. Even when you sleep, the brain is active, and all parts of the brain are always active. But at some activities, some parts of the brain are more active than other parts. And that's actually what you want to find out, because that is an indicator that some parts of the brain are connected to certain functions. So there is a default mode network of the brain, for example, that is active when you're just doing nothing, just sitting there and somehow being conscious or meditating or so. And it's actually a connection of 3 or 4 different areas in the brain.
Now, this whole idea about the brain being dynamic, I think you said what's wired together fires together. And they call it neuroplasticity, don't they? And I think a lot of people don't think of the brain like this, but it's almost like a muscle in the sense that the more you exercise bits of it, then they grow and develop. So if you look at the brain of a taxi driver or a virtuoso violinist, you'll see that certain parts are very well developed. Does that also play into behaviors like addiction? Does the neuroplasticity of the brain do that? So if you're thinking certain thoughts or doing certain actions, do those neuronal pathways grow in a way that it becomes very difficult to break them?
That is actually a very fascinating observation, that repeated action practices leave their traces, material traces, in the brain. So one neuroscientist in Germany, whom we interviewed for our documentary movie, actually said that the brain is incarnated experience. So the experiences that we make, or if we exercise the violin, as I had to do as a child, for example, that leaves material traces by neurons that are connected to each other. And so if you practice something, whether it's a good thing, like playing the violin, well, at least for me it's good, maybe not for my neighbors, it depends, or whether it's a bad thing, like an addiction, drinking alcohol and so on, that leaves traces in the brain and that reinforces that you do this even more easily. So usually when you start to do something, you need to concentrate and do it very consciously. But when you do it again and again, you get used to it, like with car driving. When you start to drive a car, you must concentrate, and you can't even listen to the radio while you are driving the car. And then when you have done that more frequently, you realize it just works by alone, and you can have a conversation on neuroscience while you are driving the car, for example, and not thinking about the traffic and so on, and it still works. So that shows how the brain somehow creates independent cycles, and you gain abilities, but you can also develop addictions, of course, by getting used to certain behaviors. And always when you are sad about something, you drink alcohol and so on. But there are always ways how you can unlearn these things again. So there is hope.
So both good habits and bad habits, it applies to them both. Now, some people tell us that the brain is nothing but a big computer. How accurate is that analogy for the brain? Are our brains more than just very complex computers? And if so, how are they different than a computer that might be designed by a very sophisticated technologist or inventor?
That's actually a very contested question in the moment, because a lot of money is spent to simulate the brain, like the Human Brain Project or the Blue Brain Project and other projects. They try to simulate the brain by using computers. But the interesting thing about the brain is that it's not just about information processing. If you think about how do I see things, photons arrive at my eye, and then my eye actually transmits the optical signals, and they are converted into electrical signals in my brain. The same happens with sound waves or with smelling things and so on. So everything that I experience in the brain, what I measure, that's all just electrical signals. But what I experience is an image, is sound, or is a smell or something. So very different experiences, and these experiences can actually not be measured or seen somewhere. They are just my first-person experiences. And the same is true for my thoughts. There is a famous experiment by a philosopher, John Searle, the so-called Chinese room. And what he basically says is, imagine a black box. And in this black box, there is a person who has no idea about Chinese language, but has been given a great book with a lot of Chinese questions and answers, just the symbols. So he can't read them, he just can identify the symbols. And so a Chinese person comes, asks a question by sending a letter through the post box into that room. And so the person inside the room picks up the letter, compares the symbols, and the output is another symbol giving a good answer. And the Chinese person outside says, wow, what a wise person inside that room. But of course, if you think about it, what does the person in the black box actually understand about Chinese and about the meaning of the question? It's nothing. And that's what John Searle says. The computer does understand as much as a toaster. It understands nothing. Because it's just following algorithms that have been programmed into its structure, so that it, on the outside, gives the appearance of simulating rational behavior, thinking, information processing, but it's only currents that are flowing there. It's only following certain rules, but it's no understanding and no meaning.
So that raises the whole question of consciousness and what consciousness actually is. And some science fiction accounts or films have this idea that if we can create a computer that's so sophisticated and so technologically complex that eventually we will get consciousness, and that consciousness is simply a function of the fact that the brain is very, very complex. Is that true? Is consciousness something that could simply be manufactured by a sophisticated enough computer, or is there a difference in the nature of how computers work and how our brain works? What is consciousness?
Well, that's one of the ultimate questions of our scientific enterprises in the moment, as a lot of philosophers would say. They are all interested, and so there are different opinions on that in science, I would say. But I would say that actually physical processes, or all of science, is concerned with function and structure. So the question is function and structure really enough to account for conscious awareness, of me being aware of something? I mean, consciousness is really hard to define. It's some kind of awareness of existence. But so people have tried to reduce the problem of consciousness to smaller bits of conscious, and they have come up with fundamental conscious experiences, the so-called qualia. So, for example, to smell something is a quaily, and to see something or to feel pain and so on. So these are the basic experiences. And the point about these is when I see something, like I see a brown chair over there in which you are sitting very comfortably, then you might agree it's a brown chair. But the problem is I will never know, even when I measure your brain with an MRT or an EEG, whether you have the same experience, the same sight, the same color of brown in your brain as I have. So it seems to me that the experience it's only accessible to myself and to no one else. I will never feel what it means to be like a bat, as Thomas Nagel famously has said. And I will never know how it feels like to be Peter Saunders, for example. Maybe that's a good thing, but it shows there are limits to science, actually. And there's a famous thought experiment again. There's the colorblind scientist Mary, living in the future, knowing everything about the physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and so on about sight and vision. But she has a problem. She's colorblind. She's born colorblind, though she knows everything about scientifically. But then there is, in the future, the possibility to undergo surgery, and suddenly she's able to actually see colors. For the first time, she experiences colors. And the question is, has she actually learned something by experiencing colors? If she has not learned something, then it might be justified to say, well, all that there is just physical facts. But it seems that to experience seeing red is an additional fact that is not reducible to the knowledge that they had before. In German, we have a saying, probieren geht über studieren. To test something, to experience something is more than just to study it and know all the facts about it. So I think there is a good case that can be made that conscious experience is not reducible to purely material facts and scientific formula.
And there are limits. Of course, our brains, as you've described so beautifully, are incredibly complex things. But there are limits to what we can perceive about the real world. We know dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear, that are outside our spectrum, that an eagle can see things that we can't hear. So we know that our brains are, in a sense, inferior to those of other animals in some areas. How much can our brains really tell us about the real world, or whether there is a real world out there at all?
Well, our brains can only tell us about the real world what input they get from our senses. So it's always an indirect access to reality. We don't have direct access to reality, apart from probably our thoughts, because our thoughts are directly perceived and experienced in our mind. But everything we know about the external reality is always an indirect experience. Like when I touch this table, I must trust that the feelings that I get in my fingers and that are processed to my brain and so on, that these feelings are actually real information about the external world. It might well be that all this is just a simulation. I can't prove that. So I might be a brain in a vat, but it's still rather implausible. Like when you tell me, I believe everything. Actually, as a physics student, I had a friend who said, I'm a solipsist. Everything around me only exists because I exist, and I'm a brain in a vat, so to say, and everything else is a simulation. So we took a lot of care of him so that we won't disappear suddenly when he dies. But actually, to go about this is, I could do something, maybe pouring this glass of water over your head, in order to show you, do you think this is still just a simulation? I mean, I could still be programmed like that, but to be in touch with reality, actually, the most plausible hypothesis is that our first impression somehow is right. And the burden of proof is on the person who believes everything we perceive is actually just an illusion. So I would say the first impression that I have is that you are real, that this table is real, that I am real. So I would say, if someone can prove me that you are just an illusion, like in The Matrix, for example, or in other movies, I would say the burden of proof is on that person.
Okay. Now, philosophers and scientists have agonized for centuries over what we call the mind-body problem, how the mind interacts with the body or the mind interacts with the brain. What are the different approaches to that? are the mind and the brain independent entities? Is the mind simply a function of the brain? And if they are different, how do they interact? What are the different understandings of that? And what's your understanding of it? How much can we know about it?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we can quite surely know that the mind is not identical with the brain, because the mind could be represented in different brains and in different versions of brains. Even the brains could be composed of different atoms or of different chemicals, and it could still be the same mind. So there is not a one-to-one correlation, and they are not identical. So that means there are three basic models how scientists try to solve this problem. The first is to say, well, everything is matter, so you call that reductionist or reductive materialism. Everything is matter and everything can be reduced to matter. And the big advantage of that is all the natural processes can be measured. But the big disadvantage of that is, of course, that you must in the end admit that all that actually constitutes us as human beings, like being intentional, having a will, experiencing emotions, thinking rational thoughts, having moral values and so on, all this is just an illusion. Even I myself am just an illusion, because I'm not a measurable neuron or something. I'm just somehow an epiphenomenon, like smoke comes up from the fire. Myself is then just the smoke that comes up from the firing neurons, so to say. And there is no room whatsoever for a free will in the end, for an own will even, because everything is determined by natural processes that are finally determined by natural laws and by random processes, of course. So that would be the first possibility, naturalism or reductionist materialism. But as a lot of scientists have realized that it's probably better to think about our human experience as being a real fact, like intentionality and emotions and so on. They claim they are non-reductionist materialists, which means they believe that we still there must be a necessary material basis for there to be a mind, which is our brain. Without brain, there is no mind. But at the same time, the mind is somehow an emergent property that also has top-down causal action possibilities on the body. Like when I tell you what is 13 times 17, I get your brain smoking, and actually the physical state of your brain is changed because you start to activate brain regions that wouldn't have been as active before. And so the big advantage of that is, yes, there is a physical basis that can be measured, but also the human experience, like consciousness and so on, is taken seriously. But of course, the weakness of that view is, what kind of emergence is that? If material processes or matter is necessary, why is it that mind itself cannot be reduced to matter? Where is the genie in the bottle, so to say? And that's why there is a third view as well that says that actually mind is real and is ontologically a real essence. It is really, and it's different from just material processes. That's what some people would call dualism, but of course there are different versions of dualism. And the big advantage of that is that you can easily account for why the mind and the brain are different, mind and matter, why there's a real difference, and why consciousness is real. But the problem is, of course, and it's a big problem, how do they interact? What's the way, the mechanisms by which a soul interacts with matter, actually? But of course, there are interesting ideas how that could happen. For example, I talked about the concept of incarnation. It could be that matter is not primary, but matter is just a function of mind. If we think biblically about that, God is spirit, and at the beginning there was only God. So spirit is primary, and by his word he creates nature, he creates matter. And as physicists, we are actually quite puzzled what matter is. We don't know what matter is because this looks quite solid, but actually it's a lot of empty space and tiny little bits of matter, of mass actually. And if you look at the elementary particles, they seem to be quite fuzzy, and they can appear and disappear in some ways. So there are interesting philosophers and physicists who would say that their bit was before id, like Anton Zeilinger, for example, in Berlin, wrote an article about that. And if information or spirit is even the primary thing, and can create matter, or matter is just a form maybe of information and of spirit, then this might be an explanation why there is a direct mechanism somehow how the soul can actually interact with matter. And we maybe might not even be able to measure a mechanism or something. But of course, that's speculation, I must admit. But that there is no mechanism does not make that proposition false, of course. We just can find out it later, maybe.
So of the three alternatives you've given, you're going very much down a line of saying it's some kind of dualism rather than the other two. And so that raises the question, can the mind exist without the brain? Can there be consciousness without the brain? The question of near-death experiences, but the whole question also of eternal life. What does the mind go on after the brain dies physically? And of course, what about God? God has no body, apart from in the incarnate Christ, but God still has a mind which can create and think and so on. So can the mind exist without the brain, and how can we get our brains around how that might work?
Yeah, that's a big question for my brain, actually. And I love to have actually a thought experiment again. Imagine a TV, and then you break the TV. Did you destroy the TV program by destroying the TV? I would say the TV program is still there, just my receiver for the program has broken. And I think in a similar way about our soul. Our soul actually is still there even if my body decays. And I mean, near-death experiences, as you mentioned, they are an indicator for that. I mean, it's a complex issue, of course, and there are materialistic ways how to explain that. But there are very interesting near-death experiences where people get knowledge and information that they actually could not have. But of course, you can always presume, as a materialist, for example, that there is fraud in all that and that people exchange information. And unfortunately, there were people who did exactly that. So there are examples of fraud, but that does not make necessarily all of these fraud. And there are 10,000s of these near-death experiences throughout all cultures. Even Plato reports about a near-death experience, and medieval painters have tunnels of light where a soul is taken to another person, Hieronymus Bosch, for example. So there is a testimony about that, and it's hard to explain how you can be aware of external reality when your EEG does not yield any signal anymore, which indicates there might not be any brain activity anymore, at least no measurable brain activity anymore, and to explain that. So I think it's plausible to assume that consciousness can go on even when the body stops working. And of course, the ultimate information about that would be information that we get from God, because He has been there and He is there. And so when we look in the Bible, I would say there is this passage where Jesus says, do not be afraid of those who actually can kill the body but cannot do any harm to the soul. So there is a difference between the body and the soul. And then when you look at Peter or at Paul, both of them are talking of their body as being tents. And they have to lay down the tent at death, and then they leave the tent, and there will be a heavenly tent or a heavenly building, an eternal building that God actually will give them, or an eternal clothing. There are different images used for that. So I would say that if we take the Bible at face value, we can't get around that point that our awareness, our consciousness, our soul, I assume that all these things somehow hang together, are maybe even rather identical, that they go on, even if the body is dead.
Now, some materialists have answered, you've touched on the question of free will already, and some materialists have argued there's no such thing as free will. We're just determined to think and say certain things. We're just complex computers. I mean, one does ask the question, if that's the case, then is their idea that there's no such thing as free will simply something that's determined for them to say? But how would you respond to that criticism that people make about free will?
First of all, if you're a materialist, of course, there cannot be free will. And if you're a Calvinist, there cannot be free will. No, just joking. That's completely a different level, of course. But all this goes back to some experiments by Benjamin Libet that have been frequently discussed and so on. And he actually measured people pressing a button and realizing that there is an activity in the brain going on before we consciously are aware that we make a decision. So these results can be interpreted in a way that the brain makes the decision and afterwards we consciously rationalize that decision. But actually there have been quite a few other experiments, like a German scientist, John Dylan Haynes, whom we also interviewed for our documentary movie, More Than My Brain. He actually did an experiment. A test person sat in front of a screen, and the screen was red or green. And the test person had to step on a pedal with the foot when the screen is green. So, and when the test person would do that, they would score and get a point. If the screen is red and they step on the pedal, they get, the computer gets a point. So at the beginning, the test person would step on the pedal and get point after point after point. But the EEG signal that is transferred to the computer exhibits patterns. And so after some time, the computer somehow can recognize the pattern when the foot will be moved. And so suddenly, the computer switches to red. So if the readiness potential in the brain, the electrical signals, actually would determine our decision, there should be no possibility whatsoever to stop the movement, to step on the pedal. But what he found out is that at the very least, there should be a veto right for the person to stop the movement. And that was the surprising result of that experiment, actually, that until very short before the movement starts, there is the possibility to say no. So that shows that the electrical potential in the brain just prepares the movement, but it does not yet determine the movement. So yes, our soul and our body are tightly connected somehow and work together, but that does not mean that electrical potentials determine our thoughts or our movements and so on, but we have the possibility to interfere. And now these movements are very simple actions. If you think about whom should I marry or what should I study, that are much more complicated decisions. And it's quite hard to imagine that these things are determined. Even though when looking back, you can always argue you had to make the decision as you did and you had no other choice. Because looking back, you have done it that way. And you can't wind back the wheel of history and at the tape of history and actually then go into that situation. But the problem about determination is always, what that would mean is that there is no morality anymore, because I can always say, I am wired that way. I was determined to slap you in the face. And I couldn't do otherwise. So it's the right of the stronger person, the rule of the jungle, that would then be the ultimate reality. And that's not fitting with our reality that we are experiencing. We experience ourselves as responsible human beings. And I think the reason for that is we are made in the image of God. So we are not completely free. We have biological conditions, we have limited minds, but we have choices. We can make our own choices, and we have our values, and our values we are educated in values, of course, but we can always say yes or no to our values, or we can even think about which values we actually want to follow, whether we want to follow pleasure or whether we want to follow virtue, for example, or righteousness. We can make a choice between values and whether we want to distance ourselves from certain values or affirm them.
So just finally, we've talked a lot about what science has taught us about the functioning of the brain, what the book of nature has said, in a sense. But what about the book of God? What does the Bible tell us about the relationship between mind and brain, or between soul and body? Can you unpack that for us and how it helps us to engage with this whole debate?
I would say the Bible, of course, is not giving us a dogmatic teaching, this is the soul, or a definition or something, and the term soul is actually used in different ways in the Bible. But what we see is that we are created as living souls. So that is what we are. We don't have souls, as some people think, but the Bible says we are souls. We are living souls. And we are living souls in a body. And when we are created in the image of God, and God became a human being, the Word became flesh, which we call incarnation, I think that it's very plausible to think about our souls and our bodies in the term of incarnation. Our soul is actually incarnated in the body, like Psalm 139, that our soul, our body is made in the womb of our mother already. But that also means that there is an intimate relationship. It's not like with Plato, that our soul can jump from one body to another body, or that the body is bad. I mean, the Bible is very clear that it was good how God made us. So matter is good, not with the ancient Greeks who said that sema soma, which means the body is actually the tomb or something bad for the soul and we need to leave it, that the spirit is free. No. There is an intimate relationship, and Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, actually had a body, a fascinating body with different functions than ours, but it was still recognizable as his body with the wound, the scars and so on in his hand that could be touched. And he could eat fish, but he could pass through barriers and walls and appear and disappear. I don't know, I just look forward to get this body too, I must admit, because it's really fascinating, not only for a physicist, I think. It's better than science fiction, probably. And our souls will live on. That's the basic message. That's the most important message. We are wired for eternity. God has put eternity into our heart. And that's why even atheists sometimes think about how can we live eternally. If you think about the whole transhumanist movement and so on, how can we overcome death? And we can say death has been overcome. You don't have to work for that anymore. But Jesus has been resurrected. He's risen from the dead. And so what we need is our life is dependent on God. He's the source of life. So we need to be reconnected to God and live with him. And by his Spirit, we have eternal life. It starts now, but it will be even more complex and more fascinating in the future. And I don't know how our brains will be wired then. Maybe we will be able to see different colors. That might explain why John has such a hard time in Revelation to describe what he actually sees and hears. We might even be able to hear different sounds and so on. So these will be fascinating experience and probably different conscious states, much better than any drugs. So please don't take any drugs or something, but look forward to heaven. And give everything for heaven and serve the Lord now.
And of course, there's so much that we don't know. And you've talked about Christ's resurrected body. And of course, he didn't become a bodiless, detached spirit. And we look forward as Christians not to being dismembered souls in heaven, but being populators of a new heaven and a new earth, where we're told we will have bodies just like Christ's resurrected bodies. And presumably that means that we will have brains as well, but different from what we have now.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure, because Jesus says in heaven there will not be male and female, and we know that female and male brain are somehow different. So I don't know. But there might be some capacity to think, and there will be something like that. But the fascinating thing is we will be there with a body, but at the same time we also are somehow the collective bride of Christ. And that reminds me somehow of the Trinity, that there are different persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, but they are one God. So right now we feel like I am me, and there are my friends or my family, but I'm somehow detached from them. There is a barrier between us, which might also have to do with sin and so on. But when we are resurrected, we will be one bride, we will be united in Christ, and we will be married to Christ. And marriage, of course, means we are one with Christ. Marriage, it's becoming one flesh. And so I believe we become somehow one in Christ, and I think we are adopted in the Trinity even. I don't know how that will look like, because we will be God's children, not anymore God's works and God's creation. So somehow we will we will participate in God's Godship and enjoy unbroken fellowship with him. I don't dare to make any predictions about that. I just think we should look forward to that.
Very exciting, Alex. It's been wonderful speaking to you. And of course, as you keep saying, there's a huge amount that we don't know about the brain, that we don't know about eternity, that we don't know about the new heaven and the new earth, that it's very exciting to look forward to. But you've certainly enlightened us, and I think we all know, having listened to you, much more than we did before, and hopefully are hungry to know much more.
We know enough to have hope for the future, I think, and that's good.
It's a great place, I think, to draw stumps. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for not putting any water over my head in order to prove me that you are not just an illusion.
Well, I was waiting for the camera to go off before I did that.
Okay, so maybe let's leave the camera on.